All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for what I know is going to be a very interesting, I hope thoughtful, and maybe thought-provoking conversation. Um, I thought I would start, and then I'm going to really step away and let the students lead us tonight. But I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of context on how this topic and this project came about. And it's sort of been an accident of timing that we have gotten into and gone deep on this subject and topic at a time when it really couldn't be more relevant in our culture and in our society. This is a project and a topic that we have done in the past and have often done with senior students, where we take a close look at a case study, the American Civil Rights Movement, with a real focus on the events of the 1950s and the 1960s, and look at how, as a social justice movement for change, people were able to successfully, or maybe not successfully, depending on your view, use tactics to change opinions, change minds, change policy. And wow, we started this right after spring break, when we were sort of at the time, having our lives shaped and influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a project we had already planned to do, and we sort of adapted and soldiered ahead to do in the already adapted and strange times of the pandemic. And then about halfway through our inquiry, the events that we'll hear about referenced tonight and that we can't help have in our minds, sparked by the George Floyd killing, started exploding in current events. And as I said, it was an accident of happenstance, but it really came at a time that helped us really bring resonance and meaning to the topic that we were discussing. And I think you'll hear, as the kids speak tonight, really informed and deepened their understanding of what our main purpose as educators for this as a history unit, as a history and English unit, was to think about those historical thinking competencies and connect them to current day. So that is the background for what this spawned. We always had the idea of doing a symposium style final product. The format of our instruction was to look at a whole bunch of different texts, and we interpreted that pretty literally from things we read, but also a lot of video as text. So we watched a lot of documentary films, we watched a lot of Hollywood films that dealt with these historical events or issues. We listened to a lot of podcasts, we looked at journalism, and then, as I said, as current events exploded, I was feeding them constantly the current events, and all of us were watching cable news and history as it was unfolding, happening live. So all of that has sort of been put into like a pot, stirred around, and then here we've arrived tonight. The format tonight is 3 panels. So we have 3 guiding questions that you're looking at on your screen here that we tasked these different groups to kind of approach, to interrogate, and then to maybe tonight. In no way do we feel we can answer these in any definitive way, but simply by asking and, as I often say, chewing on these topics, our own understanding and appreciation, and just maybe even our awareness of what we did and didn't know about things, has really come to the forefront. So our first panel tonight is going to look at this question of, why do we hate? The second panel will look at how the role of culture and how it has become like a mirror of showing us who we are, or is it? And then lastly, it seems appropriate to ask, are we doomed to repeat history? Because as we looked closer and closer at some of the events and causes and racism involved in that American Civil Rights Movement, it's apparent that any wins that were achieved really still needed to be addressed, as we've seen them bubble up over and over and over again, and happen contemporaneous to our discussion tonight. So the format is that the 3 groups each have chosen a moderator, one person that will kind of introduce the context for the conversation, will kind of guide and steer the conversation, and the panelists or the students have loosely prepared. So they have worked together over the last couple weeks to sort of structure what their arguments are as a team. How do they think they might want to approach the questions that you're looking at on the screen? And then we've talked about it being like a structured conversation. So they're going to engage with each other, and then ultimately in the end, we will invite you to engage with them. So I said, we're not really thinking we're answering anything tonight, but we're just engaging in the conversation, having the discourse. Each group also has created a very short couple-minute video that provides a bit of a context or an introduction for their topic, and we will watch those first as a way of kind of setting the table for the discussion that is going to happen. Okay. So I think we're pretty much ready to move on. Before we do that, though, I did want to just take a moment, and this is a surprise for most, and many people will not actually even recognize this name, but I did think it was appropriate because we found out just earlier today that a friend of PLP, and actually, believe it or not, a direct connection to this group in an abstract way, and for some of them actually in a direct way. Our friend Jeffrey Powell unfortunately passed away, and we just became aware of that today. It just happened in the last few days. He's an educator in Mississippi that PLP has actually been to visit and worked with 2 years ago on our first Deep South field school. And we actually had plans and had very close collaboration all this year to go back, visit again, and work with this spring. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, that trip did not happen. But the students that are even on this call today that participated in the Mississippi conference just last week actually were in a Zoom room with Jeffrey just a week ago, preparing and practicing for that. And he became ill very suddenly and was taken to hospital just a few days ago. And we unfortunately found out today has passed. So that is very sad for us, but it felt appropriate to offer a dedication tonight and to do this in memory of him, because he's connected to this topic for us, and as I said, is a friend of PLP. So with that in mind, I don't mean for that to be something that's sad, but something that is happy, because I know he would be incredibly happy to see the students engaging in this topic. He constantly found it amazing, the things that we did not understand about the South and the things that he did not understand about Canada. So it is in good spirits that I offer this tonight. And I think, I know he's looking down and would be very happy to see the event that's going to take place tonight. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop this share. I'm going to tee up the first group. So you guys are ready to go. We're going to start by viewing their video. So at this time, if you are not in the first panel, you can turn your camera off. So those who are in the first panel should have cameras on, and get ready to unmute your mics. And I will get your video ready to play right now.
America, a country that has faced countless struggles as a consequence of oppression, false notions of race, and resistance to change, struggles to break down systemic barriers, eliminate racist ideologies, and end white superiority.
And we as a people will get to the promised land.
Despite years of anti-racist education, societies in America are crippled with the desire to hate.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
History begs the question, why do we hate? Some argue that it is ingrained in us since birth, that it is caused by our human nature, or is it a consequence of our fears? Here to answer that question with me today are Logan Underwood, Luca Oliver Green, Emily Jansen, and Olivia Ward.
So we've seen some pretty big changes come from the civil rights movement, and I know that my group member Logan has done quite a bit of research into the events that have threatened the status quo. Logan, could you expound?
Yes, for sure. I went into detail into studying the desegregation movement, which was a major push in the civil rights movement that really threatened the status quo of many people in America, specifically in the South. And in the movie, The Long Walk Home, they went into detail about how into the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which was a boycott that was intended onto removing bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. And in one of the scenes where the white people were having a Christmas dinner, they had this to say, quote, "If they get by with this bus thing now, in a few years, you won't even be able to have this Christmas dinner because you'll have the maid sitting right beside you," end quote. And these kind of sentiments, that the fact that this change would ruin the traditions that they loved and they held dear as their status quo, as their life, was the part of the reason why they hated the idea that the Black people could have the same rights, be able to sit beside them in the bus. And they were willing to hate/segregate to maintain that status. And later in the civil rights movement in 1964, George Wallace was elected to be the governor of Alabama. He was elected on a pro-segregation agenda, and in his inaugural address, he had this to say, quote, "Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum of freedom, as have our generations of forebears before us done. And I say segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And that last quote was spoken of in the video that you just saw earlier. But his election was a really important landmark in the rising tide of equality caused by the civil rights movement. There was many of the recent court cases had tried to tried to desegregate the South, and he stood as the pallbearer of someone who is willing to stand up for those people that didn't want things to change. They wanted things to stay the same. Majorities are driven to maintain the status quo, and that drive can enable hate in certain circumstances.
So, Logan, when you're bringing up this example of George Wallace's election, and you're talking about how it was a fear of change that was a huge factor in that, do you think this is still the case with modern elections?
Yeah, for sure. I think the case study of the Make America Great Again movement is a really important current event that I think epitomizes what I spoke of earlier. In Trump's election strategy, he intended to speak to a certain demographic of voters, tapping into their fear of the changing demographics, especially or specifically with the addition of the influx of immigrants into the U.S. In his one of his speeches, he had an interesting quote to say about immigrants. Quote, "They're not sending their best. They're sending people that hate, that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists," end quote. And these characterizations of immigrants are obviously wrong. They are an oversimplification and an over exaggeration of basically just talking points that he intends on using to speak to a certain demographic. And there's many parallels that you can draw from the way he talks about immigrants to the way that African Americans were defined in a very popular movie in the early 1910s called Birth of a Nation, which outlined the Reconstruction era in the U.S., which went into how the post-Civil War era of the U.S. And in the movie, it really defined Black people as rapists and murderers and someone that you need protection from, in the same way that Trump used immigrants as someone that the government needs to protect you from them because they are dangerous people who are going to change your idea of life. Trump awoke a powerful demographic and spoke to a deep-seated insecurity and used it in order to be elected.
So it seems that fear of losing power plays a big role in the hatred we see from white people in power. Luca, when did you first notice this connection?
Thank you, Jesse. I first noticed this connection while watching the documentary The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, one of the first feature-length documentaries to explore the Black Panther Party. A majority of this documentary was spent on the topic of J. Edgar Hoover, a name you probably recognize. Hoover was the first director of the FBI for 37 years, an anti-communist, a racist, and a very powerful white man. Although personally hostile towards Martin Luther King, Hoover saw any form of Black organization as a threat to the status quo. Change that would have involved equality, that would have put power in African American people's hands, was very much a threat to him.
The image of J. Edgar Hoover is really cemented as the founders of the FBI. So how did his views shape the FBI's agenda in the past and today?
Well, he recognized this potential threat, and in some ways he used this fear and hatred to try to eliminate it, thus creating COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO, or Counterintelligence Program, was directed against what he called Black nationalist hate groups, but was really meant to expose, disrupt, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalists. This was everything from harassing members of the Black Panther Party, enlisting informants, or neutralization, which is basically legal murder. Hoover hated because he feared losing this political power. For with his power, he could systemically oppress anyone that opposed or contradicted his ideology.
And Luca, would you consider this oppression systemic, and how does it relate to today?
Well, systemic oppression is quite a recurring theme, especially with the latest advancements of the Black Lives Matter movement. Personally, I credit J. Edgar Hoover with perpetuating this us versus them mentality in regards to the policing system. One of Hoover's later endeavors against the Black Panther Party consisted of first arranging for the Black Panther Party to acquire guns through FBI informants, convincing the police that the Black Panther Party were armed and violent, and according to protocol, police were trained to shoot first, ending in death of unarmed or legally armed African Americans. An example of this was the political assassination of Fred Hampton, Black Panther Party chairman gunned down in his own home. Now, this is extremely relevant today as hundreds of thousands have gone to the streets to protest against institutional racism. These racist systems have been put into place out of fear of losing power. Now, this is seen in social and economic platforms as well, reflecting disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, healthcare, housing, and like Logan touched on, political power. These systems were put in place by those who feared losing their power and have been fueled by generations of hatred and racism.
So power for some brings a sense of security. People who feel insecure, be it because of their social or economic status, may turn to hate as a means of reclaiming that power. Emily, I'd love to hear from you on the topic.
Thank you. Yes, there are many historical examples, and even a lot of examples today of people feeling either the need to protect or gain a sense of security, and this causing them to turn to hate. I think a good example that we all would know about would be the Ku Klux Klan, that for close to 200 years has been one of the most prominent forces of hate against people of color. And from the research I've done, there's a lot of evidence that it was a need for security in things like their jobs and their economic status and place in society that caused these feelings of hate for many members. And then this created the consequence of this was the hate-driven actions that we've seen, such as the lynchings and the riots. And an actual example of this would be earlier in this unit, we watched a documentary called Klansville, USA, and it outlined the history of the Klan and how they got started. And in it, it said that many members had, quote, low skills and low pay. And if they became Klan members, they could better themselves, end quote. So you basically take all these people who are already financially insecure, and then you scare them with threats like, oh, Black people are going to come in your communities and take your jobs, and even like Luca was saying earlier, take your power. Well, of course, the consequence of this, you're going to be willing to turn to hate if it offers you security in these things. But I think it's also important to mention that it's not just the oppressors who can hate, it can also be the oppressed. For example, the Black Panther Party that Luca was talking about earlier, they were a more moderate opposition to the Ku Klux Klan who preached Black power and an end to oppression, which was a common theme along civil rights leaders of the day. But what made them stand out was they saw anger and hate as a justified consequence to racism and were willing to offer a sense of security to those who would join them and help promote that. Like, an actual example of this would come from that documentary Luca was talking about, the Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, where in it, it said that every day on TV, people were seeing, quote, dogs, fire hoses, bombings, end quote, in the violent Birmingham campaign that was going on at the time. But then with the party, there was, quote, emergence of voices in the community that are saying that they're not going to continue to turn the other cheek, end quote. So these people who are surrounded by danger and violence and brutality, when they're seeing that this party is going to come up and offer them a sense of security from the strength in numbers and through the powerful identity that they'd put out, well, of course, once again, the consequence of this, they're going to be willing to turn to that. But then also turning to a party like this caused them to support the hate that they were putting out. And this time it was against white people and people in power. So it seemed justified, but it was hate nonetheless. And in my opinion, personally, this is one of the most important points that we can look at today, because this kind of hate is coming on the rise a lot with recent events, because like in response to the George Floyd protests, there have been an increasing amount of cop hate posts on social media, and these are getting tons of likes and support. And in my opinion, this is because people are bonding over this kind of shared retaliation, and this is causing them to gain a sense of social security and acceptance. So they're willing to keep hating because they think it's justified, and it keeps bringing them this sense of security. And the final point I wanted to talk a little about tonight was Martin Luther King, kind of actually as a counterpoint, because he actually had areas in his life that he was secure, so he was able to overcome hate. And what I mean by this is a couple of things, but I think one of the most prominent was that he had the support of thousands of people across the United States that were going to support his beliefs, and he had the assumed safety of strength in numbers. Like, for example, when he marched at Washington, there were 250,000 other people there supporting him. But actually, even in my opinion, more importantly than this would be that he had the security of religion, and that God was going to protect him no matter what. And this colored pretty much everything he did, so he was willing to go to extreme lengths because of this. And this can also be proven with things he said, such as, quote, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man," end quote. So the strong sense of religious security was relieving the normal fear that people would feel around things that he was going through. And because of this, he was able to not feel like he had to turn to hate to gain that, like other people may feel like they had to do.
So, Emily, you gave a lot of examples around the civil rights movement, but I'm wondering if your claim can be applied to examples outside of the movement.
Yeah, I definitely think it can be, like, especially nowadays, like with recent events. If we look at the recent increase in racism against Asian Canadians, you can definitely see this as a consequence of people feeling insecure. Like, for example, this February, there was an Asian Canadian woman who was flying to Mexico back home to Vancouver, and she was getting over a cold, so she coughed on the plane. And some of the other passengers started complaining, and they went to the flight crew. So the flight crew came over and said, "Well, you need to wear a mask." And she asked, "Are you making anyone else do this?" And they replied to her with, "No, people only complain about you," end quote. And what I find really interesting about this was there actually were reported to be other people on the plane showing signs of illness, but she was the only Asian, and this was making people insecure about their safety. And she actually refused to put the mask on, but because there was this need to protect the sense of security of the general public, they continued to pressure her about it. So yeah, I definitely think like examples like this prove this claim can be applied outside of the movement.
I want to bring it back to what Emily said about Martin Luther King and his sense of security. Religion often plays a role in the way people live their lives. Olivia, has your research revealed anything about environments fostering hate?
Yeah, so people have always used religion to justify their actions, whether it be for a good cause or for a bad. It's the fear of change, fear of something being worse for their children, really. That's part of the core of that. So to try to keep that hate throughout the generations, the KKK started very young with their idea of a pure America. It starts before they can walk with mass baptisms of babies by KKK leaders. And every step of your child's development has a place in the KKK. There were the Ku Klux Kiddies and Cradle Clubs for children and infants, and two groups for the teenage KKK members, the Junior Ku Klux Klan for boys, and the Tri-K Club for girls. These older groups weren't just about hate either. The Tri-K Club, which was the one for girls, learned about traditional gender roles and sometimes competed in pageants for Miss 100% America. The members of the KKK wanted to keep this idea of a pure American society, full of white Protestants, and they thought involving the whole family was the best way to do that. And in a sense, it worked. No one questioned what they were being taught because it was easy to follow what your superiors were saying. From cradle to grave, they were drilled with this. Sorry, Emily. From cradle to grave, they're drilled with this idea of a pure American society. And so they believe it. I have a quote here from Bob Jones, who was one of the leaders of the KKK during the Civil Rights Movement. Quote, "The white Protestant Gentile, the only hope and the only salvation that they have left in this United States today is the United Klans of America Incorporated. We saved the South twice, or the Klan has, and it looks like we're going to have to do it again," end quote. They truly believed what they were preaching. And it goes to show how much you can get people to follow if it's all that they know.
Yeah, sorry, Olivia, I was going to ask you earlier. So from what we've kind of seen from the historic Deep South so far, it seems like a lot of the ideas were perpetuated from culture and from tradition. So what you're bringing up here, do you think this was a purely cultural and traditional thing, or do you think there was something more systemic behind it?
Yeah, so that brings up a really good point about the difference between de facto law and de jure law. So de facto law is the way that you're kind of expected to act. And then de jure law are laws that are actually set out by the government. And in America, and mostly in the South, though the North is in no way innocent, there were a set of laws called the Jim Crow laws. And these laws were meant to marginalize African American people, denying them many opportunities that a white person in the same situation would have. These included segregation in buses and parks, denying people the right to vote, getting an education, among others. If you tried to go against these rules, you could face dire consequences from the police or locals who felt you needed to be taught a lesson, including the KKK and church bombings and stuff. Fear of the consequences for speaking out kept these laws in place for decades and kept the South as it was really until the Civil Rights Movement. The individuals involved in the Civil Rights Movement risked their lives for a better tomorrow because they could have all died. That was always a risk. And as the civil movement, it did actually pay off. As the Civil Rights Movement went on, the rules were abolished. The Brown versus the Board of Education was one of the first cases where the Jim Crow laws were taken down, and that was disputing the idea that schools could be segregated if they were equal, but that was found out to be wrong, and so schools were decided to be unsegregated, even though that was only part of the struggle to get schools to be both white people and African American people. Other parts of the Jim Crow laws were continuously taken down as the Civil Rights Movement pushed forwards, and without the people who put themselves in harm's way, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Thank you, Olivia. Folks, I want to thank you all for coming today to listen to our discussion. The civil rights movement is not history, but educating yourselves on the events of the past and their consequences today is a step towards an equal world. Thank you to our panel of speakers, Olivia, Emily, Luca, and Logan, for bringing some amazing research to the table today.
All right, thank you, panel one. I'm sure all of our audience members are clapping. They're just muted, so you can't hear them. We're going to take a brief pause here just to see if there are any comments or questions. Ms. Willems has done a great job in the chat room of sort of dropping. Oh, I'm not sure if you're hearing that, but there's a chainsaw happening outside my house. Ms. Willems has done a great job dropping in the chat. There's some references to some of the things students are mentioning. So that's a great resource. Capture those links for visiting later on. So if anyone does have a question, please feel free to either use the virtual hand raise or put it in the chat box and I will voice it for you. We'll just take about 30 seconds or even less, 15 seconds to see if anyone would like to respond, ask a question, or just make a comment.
I believe I put a question in the chat, Brian.
Oh, I'm sorry, I may have missed it. Why don't you go ahead and voice it?
I asked them if it was kind of a very teachery question, but maybe they'll forgive me. I was curious if you, in the conversations you guys had about the KKK and sort of that rise of how they handled it, do you see any connections between how they were handling things and other historical events that you might have knowledge of?
I feel as though that's kind of a difficult question to answer, and I don't know if I particularly have the answer to that. I mean, my initial thoughts, learning more about how the KKK kind of worked and stuff, it came as a surprise to me because it wasn't like anything I had seen before. And so I always saw it as more of a unique way of thinking.
I just have a thought on that. The way that they recruited young children reminded me a lot of like Hitler and like Nazi youth camps. Of course, I don't know tons about that, but I do know a little bit about the youth KKK groups, and that is a little bit of a connection that I drew there.
Yeah, it's just as you were describing it, I was linking back to our earlier work with even Lord of the Flies. No one else? Just
yeah,
me?
there's totally some connections to tribalism and that kind of thing. It's Emily talked about this as her like main push, is how you need tribalism is a major part of hate, and I think being part of that tribe, that the tribe of the KKK, is a really powerful way of and like streamlining your ideas, and however hateful they may be.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what you're connecting to with even the Hitler Youth. And I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about like whether or not they see the rise of that or even the beginnings of that somewhere else, and thoughts about that.
Yes, there's a number of like neo-Nazi groups that are gaining power, or maybe not gaining power, but gaining notoriety in recent years, and by just the current political climate. And it's pretty interesting to see how they rise over the years.
Adley, you have your hand up in the chat room. Do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
I do. I had a question for you guys. I was just wondering if you thought it was possible to remove fear from society, or would it have to be would everybody have to be secure in themselves, or would there be a chance that everybody could be still insecure, but there'd be no fear?
I would say no, because I think fear is a very human emotion. Like, it's a primal thing that we all have. And I think there's ways to make it so that less people people are educated and they're not unaware of what their fear is making them do. So I think education's a big piece, but I don't think fear is something that can just be removed from society.
No, yeah, just to quickly go off of what Logan was saying, like I definitely think education, because fear is it's part of our human biology. It cannot be taken away, but we can learn to manage it and just recognize it as a feeling. I don't know if all of society could do it, but theoretically in a perfect world, we could learn to separate the emotion of fear from our greater intellect, and by doing that, then learn to overcome the fear and the hate.
And made me learn that there are many things that we don't actually have to be afraid of, that maybe we were taught or thought we had to be, right? Okay, that was actually a strong, I hate to cut that off, but that was a strong opening. Thank you, panel one. We are going to move to our second panel. So congratulations, that was really a great way to begin. So if the first panel would turn their cameras off at this point, and the second panel, if you'd like to activate, turn your cameras on and unmute your mics. We're going to begin by watching the video prepared as an introduction for the second group. And they've taken a very creative approach to this video and used a nice metaphor that I think will help the audience understand and get engaged immediately with their topic. So without further ado, here is an introduction to the second panel.
Humans thrive and grow off of culture, much like kombucha does. To its very definition, culture plays the role of a place to grow and create from. For kombucha, you get some tea, introduce some culture, and watch it turn into another kind of tea. For people, you get humankind and you add the culture, which is arts, music, religion, media, ideologies, creations, and all that other fun stuff, and you get an interesting human existence. Culture plays a role in showing us the growth within ourselves and humankind. Some things that affect human culture are media, movements, systemic oppression, and worldview. For the media, it's things like how the media coverage on the brutal murder of Emmett Till brought light to the rest of the USA on how black people were being treated in the South, which many people say was the spark that started the fire of the civil rights movement. It's the way that American music was changed forever by the discovery of a tune whistled by an enslaved person that then turned into minstrel shows, which became wildly popular and began the foundation of the modern American music industry. And it's the way how television shows, movies, social media, and other pop culture influence the youth to believe certain things and act in certain ways. An example of this is the current Black Lives Matter movement, in which you can see how the younger generations grew up on the media where the people portrayed stood up for what they believe in and for a better world, and now that is what they are doing too. For movements, it's in the sense that movements like the civil rights movement have made huge impacts on American culture, and how the Black Lives Matter movement is continuing to work for that nearly 70 years later. And it's much like the way Western culture was shifted in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights with the Stonewall riots in 1969, starting the movement that would eventually lead to LGBTQ+ people gaining the basic human rights they were being denied. For systemic oppression and institutionalized racism, it's the way the Canadian and American governments have medical, justice, and resource systems that are set up to support white people with money while being much less accessible for black people, First Nations people, homeless people, LGBTQ+ people, and other minorities. And finally, for worldview, it's how we see the world through our education. For example, how our own class has had a shift in our knowledge and growth in our cultural understanding after doing this unit. Our class was the kombucha in this case.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Tamara. I'm here this evening with Jamie, Izzy, Marshall, and Georgia, and we're going to be answering the question, what role does culture play in showing us who we are? So to begin, Izzy, can you tell us a bit more about the kombucha metaphor?
Yes, I absolutely can. As you learned a little bit about that metaphor in the video that you just watched, I can kind of go a little bit more into depth on that. When making kombucha, you start with tea and you add a yeast culture to the mix, and you leave that culture in the jar with the tea for a couple months. And after you remove that culture, the tea has different flavor because it is all of the culture is infused into that tea. Although this metaphor may seem a little bit weird to apply to all of humankind, it is in fact a very direct representation of our We Shall Overcome unit's effect on our class. I'm going to start by talking about systemic oppression. Systems that all humans are meant to rely on, such as education and law enforcement, are backed with a racist history and a double-dealing attitude towards the Black community of North America. A quote that I really like, it says, "It's a privilege to educate yourself about racism instead of experiencing it." This is by Sir John Barnett. And I think it really represents our experience with this unit as white people. Although this project has been extremely eye-opening, and even more eye-opening part of it is that kids as young as 4 years old are learning about the oppression they will receive from society and how to deal with police-related interactions, while I've only truly opened my eyes to the subject as a 17-year-old. Because Black children are experiencing these hard truths at such a young age, what kind of effect do you think these have on their overall worldview? Jamie, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. I think I can add on to that by bringing worldview into the discussion, as that's the main point I researched. Most of the information I found is from the Science of Adolescent Risk-Taking, which is a book by the Institute of Medicine and National Council Committee on the Science of Adolescence in the United States. Worldview is a really large part of people's lives, and it influences how we see not only the world, but only certain issues, and also our perception of right and wrong. People's brains are most open to new information when they're at a young age. So that's when most of the development and shaping of someone's worldview is. And so you can kind of see that this kind of leads to a subconscious changing almost of the perception of right and wrong. And so my main point here is that people are brought up in ways that kind of perpetuate racism with certain, if your families or peers are racist, then it's more likely that the child that they have is going to grow up to follow the same ideologies as them. And so I kind of looked at it, and there's a lot of evidence showing that some people who are actually racist, that the main problem is that they don't realize the difference between right and wrong, and the people who don't do anything about it don't have the ability to kind of see that worldview from someone else's perspective. And that's a really hard thing to do, is to shift your perspective of worldview and see it from someone else's eyes. So society as a whole more or less needs to change to stop the increase in persistence of racism as people conform to what society says, and that that makes up most of the decision making and subconscious ideas. Now, I wonder if Georgia, if you could add on to that with your point.
Absolutely. Yeah, you were just talking a lot about how people really like fitting into the system and conforming. And that connects to my own topic, which is that early acts of defiance against the system were the catalyst on which the civil rights movement was built. In the beginning, it was very uncomfortable for everybody, even Black people. Most of the people in that time were comfortable with the way things were, even with discrimination. Humans are really creatures that like stability and have a hard time changing their lifestyle when it's not their own choice. That's why the people that valued justice and equality around the 50s, 60s were so important. For example, Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus, or the people who were in the early stages of Brown v. Board of Education were so important because they really shook the system that everybody was comfortable with. And honestly, at that time, Black people were shaken and scared probably the most at first, because they were thinking that their safety would be compromised and that they'd be in danger. And that it was a fight that they probably couldn't win, since the world was built around conforming, and them conforming to white standards and all of the systems helping white people succeed and thrive. And going against that just seemed a bit impossible at the beginning. But as it started snowballing and those small acts of defiance really built up and started inspiring others to join, people on a huge scale began to realize that they had a place in the movement and they had a duty to it, and that it was their job to help. For example, with the Montgomery Bus Boycott, it started with a person who was fed up, Rosa Parks. She was fed up with how the system was running, and she was fed up with everything that was happening, so she took a stand. And everybody was nervous at first, but then over time, as they started realizing that
that, okay, well, you know, all I have to do is not sit on the bus. That's all I have to do is just boycott the bus. So then people started, people started just joining in and realizing that this was worth it, and this was something that was important, and that maybe they had a chance. And the boycott of the buses in Montgomery lasted 381 days, which is just an insanely long amount of time for a protest. And it was just sparked by one person. And looking into present day, those small acts of defiance at the beginning have led up to now with the George Floyd movement and everything. There's 60 countries around the world protesting for this movement. It's not just cities in the USA, it's now international. And I think that a huge part of that is pop culture and social media and things like that. That definitely plays a huge role in how that's really propelled the movement. So, Marshall, I know that your topic is pop culture. Do you want to, add in?
Yeah, for sure. So as we look through these movements, the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, the Black Lives Matter movements now, we can see that pop culture and what I was really interested in is music, especially, have really big roles. That might seem weird at first, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said himself that freedom songs are playing a strong and vital role in our cause, which is really interesting to me. And what he was talking about were multiple songs, one of which was called We Shall Overcome by Charles Albert Tindley. And that was kind of the unofficial anthem of the whole civil rights movement. And I think it's really interesting just looking at the effect of music on certain movements. I think we can all agree that music is an integral part of pop culture. Music is everywhere. You won't find one person on earth who's never heard any music. As we get older, we definitely gravitate towards certain genres of music, certain artists, and probably usually people we find relatable or people even similar to ourselves. As these artists that we listen to share opinions on issues, we naturally follow them through as people we look up to. The same effect has been observed so many times throughout our history, and this in particular towards civil rights movements. People who liked this Charles Albert Tindley's songs, for example, who didn't follow the movement, are now more likely to follow the movement because of the music and the representation of his song for the movement.
So Jamie, you're looking at worldview. So could you talk a bit about how music and other media that we're introduced to at a young age can affect our worldview?
Yes, of course. Marshall mentioned how vital music is in our culture and pop culture. And it's definitely been there for most people when they're growing up, whether you subconsciously kind of take in messages in the background, or whether you are older and you kind of look into the artists and that and see what they're representing. Your choice, your music can definitely mean a lot to a lot of people. And so as they get older, the same what he said with the whole the artist's values and ideas being passed on to the other people can definitely take effect. And it's definitely another source of culture that kind of influences people. And also that can be the same with the type of culture that you're interested in, depending on what your parents listen to and what kind of ideologies that music kind of shows can also increase, shape your worldview and how you perceive things.
And Jamie, you touched on how you perceive things based on the media. Izzy, could you talk a bit about how you perceive things can be caught up in the movements that have taken place?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of bouncing off of Marshall's topic of the media and how much it has done for this movement in the past while. Most of you have probably noticed the sea of protest photos and videos in any social media feed, really. And one of the big things that stand out in those protests is the defund the police campaign. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because it's really important. This campaign is not about getting rid of police officers, which is a misconception made by many people. They think that that's what this is all about. But it really is to relocate the millions of dollars going into the police department to turn it into unarmed, trained responders for specific cases. Portland City Council passed a budget recently, cutting $15 million from the police department and putting a portion of it into a new program called CAHOOTS, which stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. So this program deals with suicide prevention, conflict resolution, substance abuse, housing crisis, non-emergency medical care, and much more. And this is just a really good example of the kinds of things we can put money into instead of only the police, because putting the police towards every single individual case is not always going to work. And the Black Lives Matter or the police brutality we've seen is showing that. Yeah, well, other police department funds can benefit in mental health organizations, homeless shelters, education, and more. By creating these new systems and altering the old ones to give support to all people, and the view of law enforcement can begin to change into a more positive experience for everybody. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think I can add on to that. Yeah, you talked a lot about the defund the police kind of movement and what's going on in social media right now. And I think that it's definitely a valid thing, because when you look at the justice system, it wasn't built to protect people of color. It was built with a country that was built to serve rich white people, and it always was that way. The justice system wasn't made that way, it was built that way. And throughout the time that the police have been here, they haven't been protecting people the way, well, it's developed in a way that they don't protect everybody, and that's their job. So the system really does need to be rebuilt. And Black people have definitely been made the enemy when they really shouldn't be. It's really a vicious cycle that that society has put on them. They force them into poverty, and they don't have as many job opportunities, so they're forced into a lifestyle that gives them a much higher risk to be prone to going to jail. And I think that yeah, it's a sorry, I'm not really getting my thoughts out right, but yeah, I can definitely I think there's a lot of merit to bringing the funds into places that can really help the people rather than the police. And the police, I think that can really connect to when somebody says that, sorry, when somebody says that becoming rich, for example, it doesn't change who you are, it accentuates who you are. And I think that's really how it is with police too. Once you get power, somebody who has good beliefs and will become a police officer who enforces the laws in a good way, whereas somebody who might be racist or homophobic, when they get that power, they use it in the wrong way, especially with how much funds are going to the police. So I think that taking funds away will leave room for people to work in with a system that really serves the people.
And Marshall, do you think you could kind of talk on how media has helped bring awareness to these problems?
Yeah, so especially in recent, I guess I wouldn't call it news, but in recent social media, we've seen a lot of these posts talking about ACAB, defund the police, and things like that. And it's really interesting how these kind of things work out on social media. Usually the first wave of people who post these things are very true to the cause, and they're really looking for a change. But once these kind of social media challenges is what they become, once they catch on, it's more people doing them because they want to fit in. It's because they want to make their social media status look better than they're actually supporting the cause. Social media, we've all heard of all the effects that it can have on your brain. Multiple studies show that frequent use of social media promotes brain growth in certain areas. Areas that have connections to fast processing of media and low attention spans, which pretty much means we need more media, more images, more text per second to kind of keep us entertained. and areas relating to mental health, which can actually, so mental illness, because social media can make you feel so isolated. But on the other hand, social media can actually connect you with communities too, that you'd otherwise be separated either geographically, socially, or otherwise. I'm sure we've all seen recent things like Blackout Tuesday. A lot of people posted that. That's an example of how it can really show strength across a large geographic area. So it's really interesting the effect that social media has opposed to conventional media on recent protests, demonstrations, and that kind of thing.
Cool. And so I was wondering if either you or Georgia could kind of talk about how media has changed movements throughout history. For example, like Emmett Till, or like how that was different from like how the video of George Floyd got out, how the information for that got out.
I can add on to that. Yeah, definitely the media now has been a huge help, I think, to the movement. Like in the 50s with Emmett Till, they had one newspaper article, and that was, well, there was multiple over the time, but that one newspaper article really brought attention to the problem. And the social media and the connection we have internationally now is like so much more than it was in the newspaper. Like, it is instant. You can film a video and the world can see it instantly. And I think that's why that there are 60 countries protesting this movement now, because this video that was taken of this man being murdered by the police, there's the video to prove it, and everyone in the world has seen it. And I think that that's so powerful, and that's definitely something that wouldn't have happened, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, because the technology wasn't there yet. But the fact that the world is so connected now, I think that's a huge reason to why the civil rights movement is gaining so much speed. It's because, like down here, we wouldn't have known if it weren't for social media about this movement at all. Like, we might have heard it in passing, but it's being thrown in our face every day, and we're being forced to take action on it. Even little teenagers down here in Canada are feeling passionate about it, and I think that's something really special and something that's really enhanced the whole this whole movement, and I think it's really gonna help in the long run.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that another big part of that is just during the 50s, like with the newspaper, it'd be one person's voice, and it'd go through editors, and it would go through all these different people before finally being published, and probably only in that one town. But nowadays, when we all have our own phones, it's like in seconds we can speak our thoughts to everyone, like no matter where they are, and I think that's really powerful.
Tamara,
you're muted. You're muted.
Okay. I was just wondering, Izzy, could you talk a bit about like how the corruption of law enforcement is being handled in current events versus how it was being handled back in the day, like kind of?
Okay. Yeah. So like back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the police brutality that was happening, it is like the type of brutality is very similar today, unfortunately, the amount of violence that happens every day. But then again, white people did have a lot more power, and a lot of the things that happened with the police would be just shoved under the rug, and no one would think about it after that. Although things like that do happen today, I think because of the media and because we are now be able to catch things on video as a bystander, and there are body cams on police officers most of the time. I think that takes a huge like toll on the way that these cases are dealt with. Yeah, and I think that's a big reasoning for why people are finally getting arrested for murdering people in the street. Yeah, that's basically it.
It is pretty interesting. Well, it's not interesting, but yeah, the justice system really still protects police officers even now. Like, you look at the statistics online, and it's something, this might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's like 1% of police murders end up in the cop being put in jail. Like, it's just, I mean, it's better than it used to be due to the media, but I think it still has a ridiculously long way to go to actually be, actually really be giving justice to these people who were killed for no reason, just because the cops were using their power in the wrong way.
With Breonna Taylor's murders, there were 3 cops involved in that, and only one of them have been fired. That's it. That's the only repercussion, and I think that's it's insane when there's like, it's just being one of the 3 people getting fired for murder.
Yeah. So, as we come to the end of this discussion, I think to sum up the ideas behind our question, what role does culture play in showing us who we are, we can say pretty safely that culture plays a role in showing us the growth within ourselves and humankind. Whether that cultural impact is taught through media, family, seeing people fight for what they believe in, or seeing unjust treatment, it all comes down to taking in the information from the world around us and using it to learn and grow and better ourselves and the culture that we surround ourselves within. And that's the end.
Thank you, panel 2. Again,
thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Fantastic discussion. It seems sad to cut you guys off, but that was, I think, a really good look at the topics from a bunch of different.
You're muted.
Ooh, did it just mute by accident? Okay. We'll just pause for a brief second to see if there are any questions, comments, follow-up from our viewing audience. So anything, again, in the chat room, I've been keeping one eye on it, or if you're brave, you can raise your virtual hand. And we'll just pause for a moment to see if anyone would like to speak. Oh, Adley has her hand up again. Go for it, Adley.
I just remembered Izzy saying around the beginning of their presentation that it was a privilege to research oppression and not actually experience it. And I was just wondering if you guys had any like information about how like that kind of motto can get shared, or that more people can realize that it is a privilege to not actually experience it, but to actually just learn it through textbooks or research links.
So you mean like how to spread awareness for privilege in that sense?
Exactly, yeah.
I think definitely word of mouth. That's one of the most powerful things, is when you're not speaking for recognition, you're speaking to spread awareness, if that's to family members, to friends, even to strangers, and also accepting it yourself, not just saying I understand this, but deeply understanding the privilege that white people do obtain. I don't know if any of you guys have anything to say on that, but yeah.
If I can add on to that, I think also a big thing when you're, comparing all the different kinds of people, people of color have to learn about these things and the effects of racism at such a young age. And I think that shouldn't be limited just to people of color to keep them safe within the justice system and within society. I think that everybody should have to learn about this when they're young, because I feel like we're too old to be learning about this, even though most of our peers have no idea what any of this, they haven't learned any of this. And I feel like young people should definitely be taught about this when their brains are still, open to new information. I think that's just so important. And there's a lot of parents watching, so, I think it's just really important for kids to learn about at a young age, even if they're white.
Yeah, and I think it's important to take the time to make sure that you're fully educating yourself before you speak to people, like making sure that the knowledge that you have has good, that you have a good, solid understanding of what you're talking about, so that you can understand for yourself and you can share the right information to other people.
I love all those comments. We'll have a quick question from Miss Willems, who looks like she has her hand raised, and then we'll move to our third panel.
I just was wondering, on the topic of culture, was there anything in the studies that you did that you were surprised at, like the source of, or that you learned about that kind of came as a surprise to you when it comes to culture?
I'm a little bit confused by that question.
Oh,
can you explain it in a different way, possibly?
Like, we were talking about like how the source of some of the pieces of the things you're used to hearing about come from places that you were surprised by.
Okay.
I was thinking of some of the documentaries and things you read and watched. Do you think that there should be more credit paid? So for example, in your opening video, you talked about like the minstrel shows, right? Should we be giving more credit to the source of things that we have taken and appropriated for our own? I guess that's the way to put it. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Are you asking like one of the podcasts we listened to is New York Times 1619 that basically traced the minstrel show, the racist history of that all the way through contemporary popular music? Are you asking, were they surprised that the sources of things that they like and appreciate now might have a unsavory connection?
That makes sense now.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. I see.
See, that's why you need two teachers all the time.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised by a lot of the stuff we learned, especially early on in this unit, like as you said, the 1619 podcast. And since then I've like researched a little bit about it. Just I saw this like graphic and it was like all music genres. Like the only music genre that I believe is originally created by white people is opera. And I think pretty much everything else derived from the Black community, which that's insane. It's quite amazing, like how we've completely disregarded that almost, like in our culture. Sorry.
Yeah,
I think that's a great answer, Izzy, and I think it's something to think about too, and not something you guys need to answer right now because I know we need to move along. But I love the idea that we, the question of appropriation and how do we recognize that in our own use of things that have historically come from maybe really tragic circumstances and origins. So, and I like what you said, that connection to the idea of education. And once we are educated, what do we do with that information is a great point. Well done.
That is a nice way to introduce the next panel, because they are going to deal with that question on, are we doomed to repeat history? And the education side of that is if we have an awareness of it, then do we have the responsibility to do something with that awareness? So we'll see if the group takes that up and if we are any further ahead in our understanding at the end. So we are ready for our final panel tonight. So if panel 2, thank you very much. If you would turn your cameras off and make sure you're muted now. And if the third panel would come alive, and I see you all popping up, that's great. So make sure cameras are on for the third panel. There we go. All right. Okay, so like the other two groups, we're going to start with a short introductory video, and this video will connect directly to our first speaker in the third panel. And just a reminder, they're dealing with that big question, are we doomed to repeat history? So without further ado, let's start with their video.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to mention that Vancouver, the city which this Zoom is being broadcasted from, is located on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. The civil rights movement has come to the forefront of people's minds recently due to the major protests caused by the police killing of George Floyd. It has also brought to light the killings of other African American people that have been overlooked in the past. Many of these killings resemble those of which were committed before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On June 8th, the dismembered body of Dominic Remy Fells, an African-American trans woman, was found in the Schuylkill River, resembling all too closely the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy visiting his uncle who was killed and found dead in a river in Money, Mississippi in 1955. That police forces across the world are beginning to be dismantled and defunded what this looks like and why it's been called for by so many, as well as the negative side effects of leaving out important information, are points we will discuss. Also bringing up that our politicians and leaders have continued to whisper,
segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever,
as the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, did in 1963, that these similarities show how our past has continued to repeat into our present and our present into our future. Are we doomed to keep on this pattern of continual racism is a question that this panel has discussed to no end. And with insight from Luca Jacoby, Maggie Whitmore, Kai Zanker, Lucas Koop, and Daniel Wickstone, we would like to walk through our process to come to an understanding together. To say we are repeating history would be incorrect, and preferably the point of history continuing would be appropriate. Why is that, Luca Jacoby?
I think it just cut out there. What it was about to say before it cut off was to say that history is repeating is incorrect, and preferably the point of history continuing would be appropriate. And I just want to direct that towards Luca. Like, why is that?
So when we first got provided with the driving question, are we doomed to repeat history? I sat down and thought about it a lot because I wanted to genuinely answer it. And I was thinking about where history started and where it can be repeated. And I came to the conclusion that it never stopped. It's been continuing since in this topic since slavery started. So in 1619, Africans were brought over and sold in Virginia and became enslaved. As the slave populations became bigger and more popular in the South, they needed some type of policing. So they set laws and stuff like that, but they were insufficient on their own. So they created a thing called slave patrols, and there were slave catchers as well. These were white, untrained men who could basically keep tabs on all of the enslaved. They could go up and ask for their slave badges. So if any black men or women were off the plantations, they could use any form of force or violence or anything to figure out where they were. So as industrialization came to the South, slave patrols also, as industrialization came to the South, they moved into the southern cities. So the slave patrols followed because that's just how it was. And that's where they became professionalized, and they became the force we recognize today, the police force.
Yeah, to add on to that, the current system of the police force still has this history within it, which is often overlooked, which is an argument to dismantle the police system.
So yeah, now 200 years later, we still see how slave patrols is eerily connected to the modern police force now. The basic function of the police, besides watching over the enslaved, is largely the same, maintaining the stratified nature of in terms of race and class. So yeah, the fact that it was built from slave patrols into policing now sets a tone for the policing we see to this day. And as long as powers in countries, America in this example, are running off such a hateful and oppressive past, we will continue to see murders like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, like other groups have mentioned.
And Maggie, could you address the defunding of the police that we've seen so much in current news?
Yeah, so the way that the police have been urged to defund their departments has been the widely spread next step towards a better system, because this defunding can then go towards better community support. There was an experiment conducted in 1971 called the Stanford Prison Experiment, made up of a group of mostly white middle-aged men in the California area. The experiment divided the group into two. One half of the men played prison guards and the other half prisoners. And they planned to conduct this over 1 to 2 weeks, but throughout the trial, all of the prison guards enacted violence and aggression towards the prisoners. This shows that having power over a group of people will corrupt the powerful. The argument of the police system being corrupt isn't meant to target the individual morals of police officers, but rather the notion that being in such a high position of power does corrupt the system as a whole. Another aspect of the issues within the police system is the lack of training that most police officers receive. Police officers only need between 3 and 6 months of training and a high school degree to become an officer, which makes it an attractant of people who want to misuse this power. As we can see with the George Floyd killing, there were already over a dozen misconduct cases, complaints about Derek Chauvin, but no actions were taken about that, and this is only one of countless cases such as this. Without fixing these issues within the police system, we have and will continue to repeat these incidents and issues.
Thank you, Maggie. And Kai, what do you think, and how do you think we could break the chain that Luca was talking about a bit earlier and Maggie just addressed as well? And do you think it's through minute reform, such as defunding the police?
Thanks, Hadley. Yeah, I think both Maggie and Lua touched on an interesting point, and that's one of history. We might have not altogether broken the chain and eliminated what I would say is the cancers of racial injustice in our society. So recent outrage for racial profiling and the killings of African Americans by police officers have helped give rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, but tensions and misconduct, despite being heavy right now, is nothing new. So criminologist Gary Potter explains officers were expected to control a dangerous underclass that included African Americans and specifically immigrants. Lack of standards for hiring and or officers were a commonplace in the 1900s and similar to today's police force. In my opinion, these factors, controlling disorder, lack of adequate police training, non-white officers, and the slave patrol origins are among the forerunners of modern day police brutality against the African American community. So for the past 5 decades or so, the federal government has forbidden the use of racial regulations at the state and local level. Yet the Washington Post says that people of color are still more likely to be killed by the police than white people.
If I can interject there, Kai, I mean, I think that's pretty interesting coming from them actually, because that's kind of the topic there is actually so far in 2020, 172 white people have been shot and killed by police while 88 black people have been. And that kind of begs the question, like, is it the percentage that matters? Is it the amount? Because I know there's plenty of people on social media advocating for the message that we need to say their name for these victims, and that would kind of counter the idea that the percentage of people killed by police is what matters. Do you have any thoughts on that, maybe?
Yeah, I like that, Daniel, keeping me honest. So in this case, I would say that the study, if I look here, is built off like a per capita basis, which is debatably a truer system. But here, the newspaper database indicates that 229 out of 992 of those who died that way, as in like a police brutality case or a police killing. In 2018, let's use the stuff for 2018, and it's similar in 2019. It's 23% of the total were black, even though about 12% of the country is African American. Now, this it's definitely, you can see it's disproportionate, but I think that's important. I know what you pulled from there and that's like, they're definitely sometimes a smokescreen, and it's hard to know what's right and what's true. So thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
And if I can just keep going, this idea of stagnancy in the movement is evident in the tragic case of George Floyd that we've all experienced and taken in, which has been no less shocking in its regularity. In 2010, an African-American man named David Cornelius Smith was suffocated by a Minneapolis police officer. This was somewhat of a precursor case, and I believe that it demonstrates how the system has been somewhat maybe gridlocked. And I think just to end it off here on my part is we need to make a full recovery and like see some major reform here instead of, I would use the sense like bandaging the wound for like a later time, which I think is what we've been doing, pushing it off. So thank you.
Kai, I think that's really interesting what you were just touching on there. I would like to bring it back to our main question that we've been asked here, which is, are we doomed to repeat history? I'd just like to use a quick analogy that I was thinking of earlier this morning. Was if you take a look at this iPhone, I don't know if it's going to show up, but this iPhone, this is the iPhone 10. That it's actually the 10th anniversary of the iPhone, which means that there have been 9 other years previous to this iPhone that have been improved upon to eventually get to the point of this iPhone, which I would like to connect to society today, and in particular the United States government and the people of the United States, which have been learning from their mistakes, which leads me to what my claim is, which is I don't think that we are doomed to repeat history, mostly due to the human race's constant evolution, self-improvement, and progression. So I think that we are learning from our mistakes as the generations continue. Even if the governments try to stop us, as I know Luca was touching on about slave patrols and how the police was actually built off of that. And I think with recognizing our current privilege right now, that we are looking back at the mistakes that we have made, especially with slavery, and we are sort of revising our approach to situations like that, such as racism. Some supporting evidence of the human race's progression would be World War II and World War I. There hasn't been a world war for over 80 years. This is just some evidence supporting that. Another example would be healthcare, medicine, technology, transportation, education, and when it comes to more political topic, LGBTQ plus rights. I'd also like to talk about how there has been change since the riots relating to the beating of Rodney King, and touching on that or relating to that would be these recent riots earlier this month, and how the protesters in Los Angeles or in California were targeting more richer neighborhoods to gain more attention, and more white populated neighborhoods, which is another clear, more of a clear, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but it basically shows the fact that people are looking back on the past and acting on it more accurately and properly.
Yeah, Lucas, I can't agree with you enough, but I also think if I can put your feet to the fire here quickly, do you think, you spoke of Rodney King, let's say from then till now, do you think we've made enough change, or do you not necessarily enough, but do you think we've made big change?
Yeah, well, if you take a look at these recent riots and protests across the entirety of the United States, I think it's been in every single state there have been some sort of protest. There's definitely, the government is definitely seeing it and has acted on it, as exemplified by the Albuquerque, New Mexico's police force being revised, not necessarily defunded, but I have an article here from the Washington Post. It says here that instead of the police or fire departments responding to 911 calls related to inebriation, homelessness, addiction, and mental health, this new division will deploy unarmed personnel made up of social workers, housing and homelessness specialists, and violence prevention coordinators, which is just some evidence that supports the change that's been made since the whole Rodney King incident with the riots and everything like that. So yeah.
Yeah, to add on to that, the idea of defunding the police system does seem radical, but it has been implemented in a number of other countries, specifically Finland and Sweden. Sweden's worked hard to implement specifically educated teams to help people struggling with a mental health crisis instead of sending police who aren't trained in that area. And Finland has put a heavy focus on combating homelessness in the country by providing housing. And although that isn't a police-led problem, the effects of homelessness often lead to issues such as addiction. This also stops the cycles of arrests from people recently released from the prison complex. The slogan of Finland's criminal policy is "Good social development policy is the best criminal policy." I think that that's a really interesting way to put it. And these ideas really aren't impossible and should inspire the American police system to take a similar action.
Moving on a bit here, I know we've discussed a bit about how there has been change in, I guess, specifically America for this example. But I wanted to touch a little bit on the movements that we discussed a bit earlier. And I wanted to ask Daniel specifically about how, like, I know that Rodney King was brought up and how there was major movements in the past, but they haven't created any lasting change. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, so what I've kind of settled on is that we continuously fall into some cycles of dishonesty, as I kind of put it, because we're at a point where it's so easy for people to appear one way, whether that be on social media, whether that be even if they are out there protesting, it may not be for as genuine reasons as maybe others would like. And I've kind of settled on a bit of a claim that knowing everyone isn't together is better than thinking everyone is when they're really not, because that's what creates these cycles for us, is that we're kind of perpetually put into a bit of a position where, yeah, like I mentioned, it's just so very easy for people to come off one way when they may not feel that way and be willing to do as much. I mean, if we take a look back at the 60s, the early 60s, we saw the Freedom Riders when Black and white students would both take interstate buses throughout the United States as a bit of a protest. Now, thing is, that was one of the early occurrences of white people kind of banding together with Black people. However, them doing so, the white people that is, they weren't kind of risking that much, really. It was a pretty peaceful protest, and they weren't putting too much at risk there. And then if we take a look at the case of the Selma March, it's a bit of a similar one there.
Daniel, when you're talking about when white people aren't risking that much by putting stuff on the line, I do know of the case of James Reeb, the white priest that was killed in Selma for marching.
Yeah.
Would you like to just touch base on that?
Yeah, so that's a really good point there. So Selma occurred about just after 2 years following the March on Washington, and that was a really big kind of point in the movement itself, and I think it kind of inspired a lot of white people to voice their opinion, many of which were genuine, and they really did care for these people's rights. Now, unfortunately, people like James Reeb did not realize that the entire population of the United States had not yet followed that belief. So he didn't realize he was putting himself at risk by taking the trip down to Selma and participating in the march. So yeah, I mean, there's also a bit of a flip side to that. It's where people feel like they're pressured into protesting and to acting a certain way. American author Neil Strauss posted on Twitter that shaming people into action creates acting, while inspiring people creates change. Now, I think that is really what is going to help us in the future, and what will really create change, is because right now we're stuck in a position within our society that people are constantly forced to feel a certain way because of this kind of cancel culture that has been created. So as soon as we can break that, I think that might be the first step in breaking these cycles.
And so to wrap it up here, I just want to restate what you mentioned at the end there, that to create actual lasting change, you need to have conversations like this and make sure that people are educating themselves and not adding to the dishonesty that you can sometimes find on like social media platforms, where there is no requirements before you start posting or kind of trying to share your own opinions.
Yeah, nothing is as powerful to someone as their own thoughts. So the more that we can have people educate themselves and create an educated opinion, that's where we can really begin to take big strides in this movement.
Awesome. I totally agree with that statement. And to wrap this up again, I'd like to just say that I was listening to an NPR podcast titled "What is Juneteenth?" And the podcast stated, "We have to face the past to change the future." And I think that that's a good way to kind of end this, even to end all of these seminars, is that to move forward and to, like Lucas said, to break the chain, because we're not outside of history yet. We are still within the bubble of history. And to remove ourselves from that bubble and to break this chain, I think we need to realize what has been in the past. And I think, like Daniel said, we need to have educated conversations, and we need to be able to make our own opinions as well. And as the group's previous stated, we need to make sure that what we're saying is coming from a place of from somewhere where we're educated before we speak as well. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you, panel members, for sharing your opinions with us tonight. Audience members, also please educate yourself further. I feel like sometimes people can feel like it's enough to just source information from us, but as Daniel said, it's important to build your own opinions by educating yourself, and also educating others once you've got those opinions as well. And yeah, these simple steps are a way to sever our connections with the past. And thank you again for watching and adding in.
Thanks, guys.
Wonderful job. I'm actually going to just push a magic button here that asks everybody to unmute. So hopefully you got that push. And if everybody wants to unmute their mic, we can all give the whole, all three panels a giant round of applause. So I see some people being brave enough to unmute. And let's...
I'm just guessing at what Mr. Hughes said, but I think he would say clap.
Yes, I unmuted everybody.
You broke up quite a bit there, Mr. Hughes.
Oh,
just so
well,
you know.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me now. We will pause just for a second if there is any comments for the last panel. Any comments or questions? We have to be a little conscious of time here, but anybody like to make a final comment to the panel or to the group as a whole? So if you're students, if you're not watching the chat, there are a few very nice comments in there. People sharing how much they've learned from all of you, and I think everyone can agree to that.
I think Sherry had a question there, Mr. Hughes.
Yeah, well, do you want to read it and then see if you want to answer or give it to someone?
The pattern of human consciousness moves from order to disorder to reorder. Where do you think we are currently as a society? That's a really good question. I think that as a group, we silently
I think we kind of meandered around that question without really knowing. But I think that as Kai and Lucas kind of debated in the middle of our seminar there, that like I think that everybody feels that they're at a different point, and different societies are obviously further than others. When Maggie brought up the Scandinavian police reform, I think that that's a good point, because they have been doing that for a while. That isn't something that has just happened. And I think that I like the disorder and reorder. I think that we're probably in a bit of disorder right now. I think that with everything coming to light and us being able to look back at our past and realize our privilege and all these things that have come about recently, I think that that's an important thing to think about. I don't know if other my members want to
I
add
mean,
on that.
if I can just add to that, I think that I really like that question, first of all, but I think it also poses another question, which is, I mean, what is order, and order for who? Because you could say that we never had order, like Luca was mentioning earlier in our discussion there, is that this history it's really one kind of chunk that we're still in that bubble of history, as Adley put it. So I just think, that may be kind of interesting to think about, what is that order for who?
I fully agree with Daniel. I think exactly what he just said, that we might feel like there's order because we can, like, I can speak for at least myself, like, I'm privileged and I can see from a certain way. I can think there's order in my worldview, but like in this type of unit where we're learning so much and seeing so many different perspectives, I can say I don't think there's ever been order. There's been, I think, a quote I saw when I was doing a lot of research is that the system like mutates to the situations and makes it so it doesn't look terrible, but there's always going to have that underlying issue until something really changes.
Yeah, Luca, I think you bring up a really good point. That's like kind of the beauty of the information age and everything, like, especially for us, like, it's hard to like understand what's really going on out there. And like for a lot of us, like in a position of privilege, and I think that's kind of the beauty of like even Instagram or like all those like social media. Like, I think that's really beneficial to us.
I think we just got another question, just to wrap up that last one. I feel like I liked Daniel's comment about bringing it back to even our driving question and our claim that was, we haven't even exited history. So did we ever exit having even order as an idea or as a thought or something that was in our society, which I think is pretty important to remember. There's another question from Antonella. Sorry, I can't pronounce your name. Do you think that we can truly achieve a society that accepts diversity without prejudice? Does somebody want to? I literally have no clue.
Yeah, I can speak on that. I think that it would be ideal to, obviously, but I think that it's also important to remember the history that there is about all of this. And so I think Kai had an example that he used in class one time of if you get even just 1% better, what was it? It was if you can eradicate it just 1% at a time, or no matter what, it won't ever be gone. It'll just be smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that it actually derived from Atomic Habits, which was kind of funny. I remember coming up in the call because it was the 1% better every day that James Clear had, and it was a graph, and I remember never understanding it, and we tried to implement it into our thoughts here, and we're like, so if you could you ever abolish racism? And so we had a big conversation about it, and we ended up like coming back to this graph where if you get 1% better every single day, at the end of the year, you're only going to be 37% better. You're not going to be 100% better, because as you improve, the percentage becomes smaller. And I think that was kind of what Maggie was kind of getting at right there.
All right, let's end on that optimistic note, because James Clear is the prophet of our times. And you're right. That idea is like, if we can, these are hard questions. We said at the beginning, we're not going to have the answers, but if we could just get even 1% better each time we think about it, we'll end up in a better place. So I want to thank all of you guys. I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight and sticking through and being participating, even just as a silent audience. That helps the students feel that they have like a real authentic audience for this conversation. And I want to really take a moment and thank the students and the audience. I want to hear this as well, because I think what you've seen tonight is a fantastic showcase, not only of who they are and how competent and exceptional as learners they are, but what the audience may or may not know is that all of this work, as I said, we started this project after spring break, happened in what we call the COVID era, which is an era in which the students could have really done none of this work. Right? They had been told that their grade was frozen in time from whatever they had before the break. So I think it's a real credit and a real testament to who they are as learners, that at no time did they ever opt out or take the opportunity to just take it easy. They dove in with the enthusiasm and the vigor that we knew that they would to tackle an interesting, difficult, sometimes a challenging topic, and really go above and beyond. The other crazy thing, which really none of them really asked us about, is that, and I know some of you have probably already checked your report card, right? This is what's so great about the PLP learners that we work with, is that they like their grades, but they're, let's hope, motivated by learning, because their grades for this work were already determined like a long time ago when we had to put them into the computer. And it's a function of the project-based learning that we had seen all of this happening in the kitchen, that we knew when tonight we opened the oven, the final result was going to be fantastic. And our faith in you was not disappointed. You delivered. So a huge round of applause and credit. I hope you guys are super proud of the work that you did tonight. And I think the audience was suitably impressed and proud of your work as well. I do want to just say again, thanks to everybody. We hope we're going to join you at see you again at the banquet tomorrow. And then I'm going to stop talking tonight and pass it over to Ms. Willems for a final goodbye tonight.
I just wanted to say a thank you to everyone. I'm going to try to not get choked up. This is the picture I put in the chat earlier. I got the date wrong, but this was 2016. And in this picture, you'll see us with many of the students we met in Mississippi. This was at Jeffrey's College, which is an affiliate of Ole Miss, if you've ever heard of Ole Miss. And that's Jeffrey on the far right, who we dedicated tonight to, because he did unfortunately leave us and pass away this week. And we're really sad. And in this picture, you can see at least 2 siblings of people who presented here tonight. And we should have been on this exact trip just a mere month ago and a bit ago. And I'm sorry that you guys didn't get the chance to meet Jeffrey, because he would have loved you, and he loved what you did tonight. I know he did, and I know he would have been really moved by it. So I'm really proud of you guys, and I just thank everyone for coming and for having great conversations, and we'll keep the spirit going. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.